Lepo pozdravljeni vsi skupaj. Dobrodošli na debati, ki jo organizira Katedra za medijske in komunikacijske študije Fakultete za družbene vede. Takšno debato organiziramo, kot ste morda že opazili, vsako leto in je navadno povezana z našim letnim dogodkom podeljevanja nagrad za izjemne dosežke strani naših študentov in tudi drugih zaposlenih in je mišljena tudi kot srečanje zdajšnjih in bivših študentov. Zaradi trenutnih razmer smo se letos odločili, da bosta ta dva dogodka ločena, tako da vam za danes tukaj ponujamo debato na neko temo, ki se nam zdi v trenutnem času, sploh glede na kontekst, ki je ta, da danes poteka med drugim inauguracija novega ameriškega predsednika in podpredsednice Združenih držav Amerike. In v tem kontekstu smo se odločili odpreti vrsto tem, za katere se nam zdi, da so izrednega pomena za področje, ki ga preučujemo, torej medijske in komunikacijske študije. Ker je danes z nami tudi gost, ki prihaja iz Združenih držav Amerike, bo debata nocoj potekala v angleščini. Zato bom zdaj po tem kratkem uvodu na angleščino tudi preklopil. So again, welcome everyone to tonight's debate. As mentioned before, it's part of our yearly series of open debates on contemporarily relevant topics. Today we are here to discuss a series of questions that we probably won't be able to wholly answer, and it is questionable whether most of these questions are exhaustible in a relatively short amount of time or even at all. The questions we will be posing ourselves today are tightly connected to today's event, that is the inauguration of the new president and vice president of the United States. But maybe it's even more fair to say that they are connected to the end of the mandate of the previous president of the United States. Now, of course, the question that first comes to mind is, why would someone like Donald Trump be of special importance for media studies, for the understanding of public communication and so on? Well, the answer was obviously provided in oh so many ways and many, many times by the previous American president himself. That is, Donald Trump as president introduced and the movement, if we can call it so, that supported him, introduced a way of speaking, which, as we all know, is not new to a certain extent, but however has certain new elements we have to understand in a contemporary setting. So, as you all probably know, Donald Trump's preferred medium of communication has been Twitter. It was used, Twitter, the social media platform, which describes itself, or at least as a microblogging platform, was used as a tool for direct contact between Donald Trump as sitting president, and even before as someone who was a candidate for US elections, as a direct means of communicating with his voter and supporter base. Now, this sort of immediate communication is something that is relatively new, we could say, at least in the form Donald Trump. So we could see daily tweets numbering in the dozens. Some of them were to a large extent vulgar, contradicting, and so on. And a while ago, you could all see a certain event took place at the end of Donald Trump, very close to the end of Donald Trump's presidency, when where a bunch of Trump supporters who were inspired by several things, among others, Donald Trump's claims that the elections in several US states were stolen, and also inspired by a bunch of conspiracy theories, which Donald Trump himself was battling throughout both his campaign and his presidency. The most famous of one being the QAnon conspiracy theories, but of course also other more general tropes, such as references to an unnamed coastal elite, or for example, the deep state, which somehow prevented Donald Trump from executing his mission to its fullest, come to mind. Now, Donald Trump, in his rather blasé and vulgar style of communication, is not a unique phenomenon. A couple of decades ago, 20 years ago, we saw in Italy, the country which is just next to us, the rise of Silvio Berlusconi, a leader which had a very similar, to a certain extent, approach to the media. So in a way, he preceded what we later on came to call a sort of post-truth or post-factual conditions, and we will debate whether such a claim or such a description is apt in the coming minutes. And we see this kind of approach to the media happening all over the world, from Brazil to the Philippines, and of course to in our own country as well. So I would like to invite, first I would like to present the speakers who have been so kind to join us today. So I'm going to start with Dr. Matthew McManus. He's a professor of politics at Whitman College in Walla Walla in the state of Washington in the USA, where he teaches courses on citizenship, political and human rights, and is researching the identity politics aspect of the political right. He's a critique of postmodern culture and is a defender of a cosmopolitan version of liberal socialism. Hello, Matt. Then we have—
Thank you very much for having me here.
Yeah. Then we have Dr. Ksenija Vidmar Horvat, who is our local professor. She's a professor of sociology at the Department of Sociology at the Faculty of Arts, where she teaches courses on the sociology of culture, and her research interests include the globalization of culture, questions of post-national cosmopolitanism, cultural identity, cultural memory, and other related topics. Hello, Ksenija.
Hello.
And then in the end, we have Mojca Pajnik. Mojca is a professor of media studies at our department at the Faculty of Social Sciences. She teaches courses on globalization and migration, the European public sphere and political communication, among others. And she is also a researcher at the Ljubljana-based Peace Institute. Hello, Mojca.
Hello, hi to everyone.
So, the debate is first gonna be in a sort of closed format. So we're gonna start with a couple of rounds of questions and then open up the floor to questions from the audience. So I would like to start with the event and the sort of condition or situation I mentioned in my introduction. So the recent event of the storming of the Capitol Hill, where we saw, as mentioned, a bunch of Trump supporters, a lot of people who were supporting the QAnon conspiracy theory. We saw a certain amount of violence, a certain amount of fanatism. And all of this led eventually to Trump, who being suspended from Twitter because of his support of what was going on, and also to because of his many dog whistles he keeps on using in his communication. And I guess my first question is very, very general. And my question would be, how did we come to this sort of situation in the first place? So what led us or brought us to a certain state of affairs that allows for the storming of the US Congress from a mob, and why are they doing so? Is it something we can ascribe to the media landscape and the way it has changed in the last couple of years, or are there larger forces, so to speak, at work? Matt, if you would start with answering this question, please.
Of course. Well, first off, I just wanted to say thank you very much for having me here. It's a shame that we won't be able to meet in person, since the university looks beautiful from the photographs I've seen, but maybe one day. So I should say that on the issue of the Washington riots, I think that there are many different ways that we can approach this. And some of them certainly do pertain to the media. And Trump himself and allied associations like Fox and the One American News Network bear a lot of personalized responsibility for creating an atmosphere of mistrust and agonism. And I'll talk about that a little bit more with the next question. But I think the roots go a lot deeper than this, since a lot need to happen before these kinds of hyper-real media tactics would become viable. So one of the first things to note is the impact of the neoliberal assault on democracy and democratic culture over the last 40 years. Democracy flows from a commitment to what people like Axel Honneth will call civic or social freedom, which in turn is linked to a historical conception of how time operates. We see ourselves as embedded in thick communities who have their own dialectical role to play in something bigger than themselves. And consequently, it's important for us to prioritize our social freedom to cooperatively conceive of and dictate the laws and mores that are going to govern us. But from the 1980s onwards, social freedom and democracy were attacked by neoliberal reforms, keen to insulate capital from public pressure. And this was very nicely espoused by Margaret Thatcher's famous dictum that there was no alternative to the status quo. In other words, to invoke somebody like Francis Fukuyama, history had ended and our side won, so there was no real need for meaningful social or civic freedom to be granted to the demos, since they could only choose from a very rare, narrow range of options. And we saw this with structural adjustment programs, a string of decisions, particularly in US courts, which led to moneyed interests having an ever greater say in what was going on, the overturning of democratic demands in Greece circa 2015, and so on, and so on. This opened the door for right-wing populists like Trump to emerge, because rather than calling for democratic renewal, which is what I think we should be doing, they adopted a kind of simulacra of democratic language by invoking a mythologized people who are essentially being screwed over by a collection of intellectuals, the media, and the undeserving low classes, particularly minorities, foreigners, and so on, those who didn't belong. Consequently, the way for this people to achieve its ambitions wasn't to agitate for democratic renewal, but instead to vest their faith in a strong man who alone had the power to speak for them and demolish their enemies. And you see this kind of rhetoric with Trumpism from the very beginning. During the 2016 election campaign, he consistently would say things like, "I alone can fix the problems, put your faith in me," that kind of stuff. And we've all seen these particular rhetorics and aesthetics of Trumpism. These were obviously faux democratic sentiments that didn't even need to include a plurality of the actual citizens, and in fact depended on millions not buying into them, so Trumpism could contrast itself to internal as well as external enemies in order to keep the base mobilized and hyper-partisan. Given all these factors, it's no surprise that many people feel that democratic elections in the US and elsewhere are illegitimate. And This is in part because the rhetoric of right-wing populism is that only the legitimate people and their leader count, and consequently only they can actually rule. And we can talk a little bit more on this later on, since I think there are a lot of other factors at play in this, but that's kind of big picture story that I tell on a lot of my work.
Mojca, I guess I would let you continue and expand upon this, and maybe perhaps would you draw any sort of parallel between the US situation and perhaps our Slovenian situation or some other European situation?
Okay. Yes, just to continue and to draw on Matt's points, I would agree also that a visible characteristic of contemporary age of political communication that is marked by the proliferation of mass media and the internet brought the rise of the populist political communication that is becoming a kind of a pathological normalcy in the populist zeitgeist, as Mude would say. So it's a kind of communication that is characterized by tendency towards strong personalization, as Matt already pointed out. So privileging negative news, shifting political style from informed debate to highly personalized and effective appeals that have a strong potential for mobilization of the masses. So what we've witnessed now in the Capitol Hill riot. There are various concepts that have been used to explain these larger structural changes made. At the beginning, you mentioned post-fact, post-truth society, post-democracy by Colin Crouch. He used this term to analyze how actually democratic structures are becoming emptied, how so classical leadership that we knew is declining and is giving centrality to reduced and simplified speech using like Trump exemplified techniques of manipulation. So I think what we are witnessing is the emergence of a kind of an antagonistic worldview, so an image of a society that is separating us into two groups, so the good ones, the bad ones, so very simplified vision of the world. And there is another concept that we were using in our populism research, the concept of illiberal democracy that I think can also help to explain these larger structural changes when actually democratically elected regimes routinely ignore constitutional limits on their power and deprive citizens of basic rights and freedoms. And we've been witnessing Trump doing that. So the shift towards this illiberal forms is the outcome actually of the governments around the world that ignore the balance of power, that attack independent institutions, including the media, and that deny the rights of minorities. And yes, we've been witnessing these trends exemplified in Central Eastern Europe as well, Hungary, Poland, Slovenia, and so on. So we are debating again now abortion rights and similar. Where do media fit in? Yes, as Matt already said, I mean, there are several angles, and we will touch, I'm sure, some of them in this discussion. The thing is that these structural changes, this populist polity, and its interplay with the media contributes, with the hybrid media, contributes to polarization of society. So the more messages with the populist stand are spread by the media, both mainstream and social media, the more we face the situation where opinions are actually becoming more extreme. So the more populism is there in public discourse, the harder I think it actually gets for the individual to have a moderate opinion on social issues or to avoid negative emotions. And we've seen with Trump and in general that online news actually feeds onto this negativity. So we've been reviewing studies on populism and different kinds of media, and they show that actually there is a natural ally between populism and tabloid or commercial media and social media. So Twitter and Facebook media consumption actually are found to increase voters' inclination to support far-right parties. We can see this connection. So individuals with populist attitudes tend to have higher trust in social media and in tabloids, and lower trust, and they would evaluate public media performance as bad performance. So they would denounce public media as the lying press, the Lügenpresse. And just before I finish, just a brief historical insight. In the 60s, an American historian, Richard Hofstadter, published the book, The Paranoid Style of American Politics. So yeah, Trump, as already said by Matt, so it's not from today. So already in the 60s, Hofstadter spoke about the heated exaggeration, the suspiciousness, the conspiratorial fantasy, the Manichaean debates that are spreading across the political and the media field. And I will conclude by citing Barbie Zelizer, her chapter in a recent book on Trump and the media, who reminds us actually about this historical legacy of Trumpism. She argues that already during the Cold War, via McCarthyism, a very particular kind of journalism evolved in the US polity and elsewhere as well, that actually concentrated on the enemy formation and had less to do with facts and more to do with moral assumptions about how the world should actually operate. And this enemy formation is nothing new, but I guess what is new is this hybrid media context that actually works well for the populist type of politicians. So Fox News, Trump grew from this legacy of objective, balanced journalism that actually was based or was reproducing this enmity already decades ago.
Thank you, Mojca. So I would like to invite Ksenija also to add her contribution to the questions at hand. So Ksenija, what can you tell us about the topic?
So I will try to refer to both Mojca and Matthew. Interestingly enough, Mojca, Paul Krugman just recently quoted Hofstadter's study of the paranoid style in American politics as something that we should be looking into. That is a long period of conspiracy theories, political paranoias, of course, bred with populism. So definitely there is something there, not just in the US, but globally. Conspiracy theories are part of the European historical legacy. So we have to look into these origins. But I wanted actually to start where Matthew started, with end of history and Francis Fukuyama, because it seems to me that that is really the origin of the phenomenon that we are seeing accelerated at the moment. So definitely Trump is not a novelty. It's something that's been in the making for at least 4 or 5 decades. So why the end of history plays in this game? With the end of history, we thought, globally, it was served to us that with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War era, we are entering the global period of the rise of democracies. But already in the 1990s, but definitely first decade of the 21st century, it became apparent that this was not the case. and that we were witnessing a rise of autocratic populism across the globe, but most importantly within the Western democracies as well. And populist turn, or the turn to post-truth paradigm, started actually with George Bush and his aversion to basic science, his attempt to introduce creationism in school curriculum. Before that, it was Reagan who actually started the trickle-down economy. So we are witnessing 4 or 5 decades of the neoliberal turn, which nobody was watching or examining what's actually been producing in the West, in the liberal democracy. And what's been producing is enormous and quite fast decline of the working class in socioeconomic status, but also decline of the lower middle classes. And that, of course, accelerated after the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. So already in the 1990s, American philosopher Richard Rorty warned actually, that in the US, there is an opening for an authoritarian leader to come and take over the American politics, so 1990s. And Francis Fukuyama accidentally just recently revisited his thesis about the end of history and basically said, I was wrong. And I did not pay attention to what was actually happening in the West, being overwhelmed with the fact that communism is dead, the eternal enemy of the US politics since the 1950s, of course. So what we are having here is really enormous socioeconomic strength on the lower classes, disparity in income on the one hand, and loosening of the historical role of the working class, especially white male population, which Fukuyama now assigns to the rise of the identity politics. So basically we have a resentment toward the elites, especially intellectual elites, who are now more concerned with what in the eyes of the working class is seen as historical injustice. They are now more concerned with these new minorities, with racial discrimination, with multiculturalism. And in fact, the intellectual left in the first half of the 20th century was the ally of the working class people. Since the 1970s, this has not been the case for various reasons. So basically what we are having here is a huge resentment, and that resentment we can find also in Britain, for instance, also in the Netherlands, but it was less successful. So what I'm afraid at the moment, going back to the events on the 6th of January, is that we will see the MAGA people who appeared at the Capitol as actually identical or representative of this huge population, really. It's over 74 million people, and some are just traditional Republican, but many of them, 40% of them, endorse Trump still today. We need to really go back into details, into the detailed political, economic analysis, sociological analysis, to see what has actually contributed to this anger, to this violence, and treat that separately from militia, from racism, from supremacy, because that's another strand in the US that goes back to the Ku Klux Klan. Why these groups united? As we know from populism research, populism is very open to accommodate various groups who are anti-elitist. That's one condition. And second, that they all endorse fantasy of a strong leader who will turn the wheels of the progress backwards. And the wheels of progress, of course, include also democratic institutions. So basically, that's why we see QAnon people marching together with people who are on other fringes of the right. You can see them together with the military, Proud Boys, but also with just Republicans who think that they are in the mission of cleaning the swamp, not knowing that they are actually supporting the swamp. So basically, I think we need to be very careful when we look into this populist resentment that has been mobilized by figures like Trump. Speaking globally, where we have global authoritarian populism on the rise, what research shows is, for instance, in Russia or in Philippines, there is the lifestyle middle class, which is actually the most supportive of this kind of rule, because it basically, this new class is not concerned with political democracy. All they need is status quo and affluence as they have lived it in the past 10 or 20 years. So in summary, it seems to me that's very important that we look into longer period, that we do not treat this attack or on the 6th of January only as a lunatics manifestation or delusional manifestation of delusional people, but actually look into what's the structure of this delusion and why it is so successful globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Ksenija. It seems to me that all of you have emphasized that the sort of condition we are in cannot be reduced to sort of only media momentum, but has to be understood through wider and longer economic and political trends that have been going on in the West and elsewhere in the last 30, 40 years. However, I want to return us with our conversation back to the media aspect of the whole shenanigans. That is, the populist moment, the mobilization of resentment of the same working classes that feel disenfranchised, or perhaps the white middle classes that Ksenija spoke about, which, as I think it was Gregory Posch in our local journal Mladina once said, that the people who will bring fascism are not the working class, but the people who will not be able to buy a new Volkswagen. I would like to shift our focus from these wider socio-economic questions to the question of social media and Twitter in general. So Mojca already mentioned, and maybe she can start this round perhaps, the ongoing and increasing polarization that has been happening on social media, via social media, on Twitter, Facebook, and other forms of it. So we know now recently, where did they? Okay, I'm sure she'll be back.
It was those right-wing hackers you were talking about.
Yeah, seems so. Well, let's continue. So yeah, there's definitely an element of polarization that is getting exacerbated by social media, at least to a certain extent, by the architecture of social media, by the architecture of social media that functions in a way that mobilizes affect as something that produces far more viable information to analyze than more of a stale civilized debate. But the recent Donald Trump ban, I think, opened up two questions, at least two questions that I want to bring to the forefront right now. So one of these questions would be, what do we really think about the Donald Trump ban? I mean, from one perspective, one can reason that, of course, there is some legitimacy in blocking the account of someone who was inciting a riot. From another perspective, social media company, which is almost, if not basically, a monopoly, that has an enormous amount of control over public speech, has been able to block the sitting at the time US president from publicly communicating. So I guess my first part of the question would be, is this a state of affairs we really want to be in? Do we really want large social media monopolies to have such a huge amount of power? The second part of my question would be, would relate to the fact that now, after Trump's Twitter ban, there has been a lot of talk about right-wingers moving to other social media websites such as Parler or Gab or whatever. And I propose that we talk about this danger of, let's call it fragmentation of the social media public sphere, if we can call it that. So on the one hand, there is already a problem of polarization of public opinion that is happening on the already existing social media. And then on the other hand, there is a danger which is not admittedly yet pronounced at this time, that there might be a split between totally different social media spheres at a certain point. Now, this is made more difficult due to the widely known so-called network effects in social media. So the more users a certain platform has, the harder it is to compete with her, because obviously, if all of your friends are on Facebook, you're going to go on Facebook and not a Parler or Gab or whatever. But still, I don't know. Ksenija, do you want to start with this one?
There's been a lot of concern raised recently as regards the ban by Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. And it seems to me that that concern is legitimate, definitely, because we do not want big tech and some YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter to really have that much of power. And we should be quite clear that all three actually censor users on the right and on the left. So we don't really know what's the measure of decision. And my concern, first of all, is that this should not be left to the big tech, but would actually need to be regulated by a public body. So it's just a symptom, really, of the regulation coming quite late, or not coming at all. We are only having the debates and hearings in the US Congress as concerns the US. In Europe, in the EU, we have some debates about regulation finally hitting the stand, but still, it seems to me that it's all happening way too late. But as said, public authorities public bodies should be in charge of regulation, and big tech should really basically just follow what will be legislation in that field. My other concern is that when people in public offices are treated by social media as individuals, when you're president of the United States, you're actually a public person in charge of public institutions. So you're not on the same page as I am as an individual citizen. So in a way, you are representing the institution, the public office. And if you're tweeting your opinions, in a way, you are making a profile of that public office. And it seems to me that that's a problem. When you tweet under POTUS, that for me is quite a clear sign that you're actually tweeting as the president of the United States, who at the moment, until today, happened to be Donald Trump. So we got the wrong impression of what's the public office of the president, and the same is true in Slovenia as well. When you have prime minister using the official account of the government, I assume that that's official voice of the government, whereas we often see that we have opinions of the prime minister as an individual. So basically, we need to have a new round of education in e-democracy, because we really do not. We are not paying attention to how these two discourses that are different power discourses merge on social media, and act accordingly. Now, just briefly, why social media are so popular now for the populist politicians? Because populism is a politics of emotion, and social media works with emotion. So there's a natural elective affinity, to quote Max Weber, between the two. And just recent research study done by international consortium reveals that if people are given more sources to get informed about issues like migration, discrimination, etc., they do not change their views, basically. So what Mojca said, basically we stick with the sources that we think share our political ideas, our moral values, our ethics, and we are really quite resistant to open up our horizons. So again, just more sources, new sources, does not solve the problem. We have a huge pluralization of media landscape, but we do not have pluralization of public mind. Not at all. We have polarization, as Nate, you said. So basically, we have to have a different agenda, which would have to go back to looking into how e-democracy works and how e-platforms and e-public space is really organized and sanctioned properly.
Thanks, Ksenija. We're going to leave Mojca last this round. So, Matt, I'm going to ask you whether what's your follow-up to this question?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd like to say is that I absolutely agree with everyone when they're pointing out that the roots of these right-wing parties go a lot deeper than this Trump or Viktor Orban or the emergence of Law and Justice in Poland, for example, or Matteo Salvini. You know, I think, as you pointed out, that you can look at somebody like Berlusconi as a template for what was to come starting in the early 2000s. And I would also point out, following on like an earlier comment, that the Bush administration in the United States set the template for a lot of what was going to emerge with Trumpism. I'll never forget the comment made by Karl Rove in 2004, where he said, you people are all part of the reality-based community. We're an empire, we create our own reality. Now, I mean, when you're talking about post-truth, you don't get much more explicit than that, right? Allegedly to call it Rove, I should say. But there are two large, there are a lot of big questions here that I want to tackle. I'll try my best to be brief. So thinking back to my youth, there was a lot of optimism in the early 21st century that digital technology would prove a medium for two important developments. Firstly, the education of citizens, and secondly, the gradual breaking down of social and civic barriers. This was, of course, a very distinctly right liberal attitude attached to a meritocratic and market-oriented ideal of what citizens should be, and dissociating problems in the demos to a lack of education and communicative opportunities. Now, I don't want to dismiss digital media, since I think under the right conditions, it can be useful. You know, I'm also a podcaster and a YouTuber in my spare time. So I think that there are a lot of good things that can come from digital technologies and digital politics. But as a lot of people have pointed out, what we've seen with digital technologies is less aligned with this kind of utopian conceit, or even the ambitions of people who promote things like digital e-democracy. And what we see a lot more of is an ugly surge in partisanship. And I think there are three related reasons for this. The first and the simplest, and here I'm evoking Jürgen Habermas, is the collapse of the liberal public sphere. So the liberal public sphere, starting in the 17th and especially the 18th century, was where shared epistemic and normative standards, largely held by educated and technocratic elites, and ideologically propagated as a kind of hegemony, provided a kind of social glue holding things together. Instead, as a number of presenters have said, there are now plurality of digital bubbles. People enter and rarely leave, meaning there's a lack of shared epistemic and normative standards sufficiently powerful for there to remain hegemonic. And this provides opportunities for new kinds of discourse to emerge, but as we also have seen, many dangers when people turn to reactionary impulses. Secondly, I think we can follow people like Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman in contrasting the way information was presented and disseminated in print medium to how they're just presented and distributed through digital medium. As pointed out, digital medium is very much an effective medium. Print media like books and physical newspapers have their limitations, of course, not least of which they typically had to be physical, but they do have the advantage of requiring readers to engage with complex long-form material And back in the day, this also included presenting contrasting viewpoints at a relatively high level of complexity. By contrast, televisual and now digital media is sensationalistic and rewards immediacy, meaning the appeal, as mentioned, is to affect. This becomes even more problematic when we think of these information bubbles as being defined by a kind of tribalistic and identitarian attitude. You know, people join in them, not just to get information, but also to feel like they belong somewhere. And this brings me to my third point, which is the hyper-real form political advocacy takes when we see digital media ascend as the primary way people interact with politics. So Guy Debord once said that we are living in a society of the spectacle. What I think he missed is that most people yearn for a sense of real politics, and for that matter, a sense of real history and social freedom, contra the quasi-Fukuyamist thesis, which means they invest the spectacle with sublimated qualities it doesn't warrant in other circumstances. And here someone like Zizek does a great job of unpacking how this can turn into new kinds of ideology. But I think a great example of this tendency to sublimate various digital forms of politics is exactly the QAnon conspiracy. One of the nice things about conspiracy theories is they combine a lot of things together that people like, a sense of being victimized by an oppressive power that apparently is attentive enough to you to want to victimize you. It also provides you with a sense that you alone are in the know, and you've kind of broken through the barrier of lies and hegemony that kind of conceal the way that the world really is. And of course, it provides you, above all else, with a unified framework to interpret reality, but not just any unified framework, a framework where human agency is at the root of everything that goes on, which I think can be very comforting, right? In many ways, it's a lot more comforting to think that the Chinese are the ones who manufactured the coronavirus and spread it, since that implies there was some human agency to this, rather than the far more terrifying truth, which is just it was a freak accident, and we actually don't have very much control over what goes on, despite our conceit to the contrast.
Thank you, Matt. Welcome back, Mojca. I guess by now you've sort of understood where we came to. So do you have anything to add to this part of the conversation?
Yes, I apologize. My line broke down. So yeah, the reflect. I would briefly maybe add to the new digital, to the new media, digital media debate. So we are seeing politicians largely using social media, as Nate, you brought up these questions. So we are seeing the rule by tweet politics. So like a new type of political power emerging, and it's actually creating a totally new type of politics where individual politicians are actually producing say-so politics. And I think this say-so politics is undemocratic in itself, because it claims the power of a king, so of this nice politician who has all the power and against whom there is no redress. So tweeting politics is top-down, remains a highly top-down politics. And and it also doesn't allow any inclusive form of debate. It doesn't allow any reflection. And it is precisely this reflection and debate that gives political democratic institution actually their purpose. So with this Twitter new politics, we are seeing deliberation, the use of reason in public discussion becoming totally unnecessary and unwanted. So indeed, as Matthew and Ksenija already pointed out, so we are facing a totally new situation that would require new answers. Briefly, I would like to draw a bit of space, a bit of attention to what Ksenija mentioned. You mentioned emotions or affects. It is indeed that via this digital media, affects are easily mobilized, and they are not merely individual responses that have been collectivized in the Capitol Hill mob, but they are actually producing or constructing new types of social relations and social structures. We are now in populism research. We are particularly looking into these affective structures, and it's very interesting how they are creating what Arlie Hochschild in her seminal study from the 70s on the emotional labor called the feeling rules. So they're producing some kind of expectations of how people are supposed to behave. And they are mobilizing anger, violence. They mobilized anger, violence in the example of the Capitol Hill mobs. So Moms for America, the QAnon, the Phyllis Schlafly Eagles, the Tea Party Patriots, the anti-abortion groups. So all these various groups that came together in the Capitol Hill mob. It was an angry mob who was exposed to this, what Matt described before as this bubble communication. So it was anger-inflicted communication that was produced by Trump during the years and his media supporters. In our research, we also found some peculiarities of this anger frame in populist communication that actually resonates very strongly with the sentiment that arguments in favor of any legislative outcomes are not valid. And this comes together with the angry supporters of Trump who didn't recognize the results of the reaction. So we are seeing this anger frames or anger inflicted communication that is very prone to attitudes that that in a way counter legislative outcomes, or that, as you already pointed out before, spur or tap onto the conspiracy theories. So, so what to do about it? So this Twitter rule politics, I don't think it has the capacity to be broken by Twitter or by any corporate, monopolistic or algorithmic power holders. So yes, Trump's account has been suspended, but it's clear that it was suspended after he lost the election, so not before. So I think that the future, like, I mean, Ksenija, you mentioned the need for some new type of digital education. Perhaps we should add to it a new type of digital regulation that I guess is one of the future mechanisms to deal around with this kind of Twitter superpower politics. Yes, I will end here.
Thank you, Mojca. Now I guess it's time for our final round of questions before we open up the floor for the debate. And I guess I'm gonna have to start with you, Matt, again, since you've mentioned you're in a bit of a hurry. I guess what I want to ask right now is the old Leninist question of what is to be done. So basically what Mojca was already trying to explain, but asking it in a way that is aimed at figuring out an answer to how to restore or perhaps re-innovate or create a new form of public sphere of deliberation. How do we counter affect-based politics? And Mojca already mentioned that she thinks that any sort of media-only based solutions are far from enough to counter populist discourse the way we framed it throughout this debate. So I want to know first, Matt, what your thoughts are on the what is to be done question.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm happy to take questions afterwards. I apologize, I can't stay for too much longer. I just have faculty meetings since our semester is beginning next week. So all the fun that comes with that, right? But I think that postmodern conservatives like Trump have learned how to invoke a populist rhetoric which appeals to certain aspects of modernity, sometimes more overtly than others. In particular, with the emergence of things like the intellectual dark web, which tries to provide a kind of defense of Trumpism, we've seen how conservatives and reactionary, even those with a virtually mystical or orthodox religious viewpoints like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro, have kind of learned how to appeal to enlightenment tropes about reason and logic to dignify Trumpy sounding arguments with a kind of scientistic or rationalistic gloss. And I think that gaining space for a renewed left involves two tasks. The first is denying conservatives this vocabulary and reclaiming the rhetorics of reason and enlightenment for ourselves. One of the problems that postmodern theorists run into, Michel Foucault being an exemplar here, was precisely how to agitate for a progressive and democratic project without appealing to the principles of modernity. And I personally think that we shouldn't shy away from appealing to those principles. We should claim that our ambition is a world where all people are treated as moral equals. And consequently, since we're all moral equals, everyone should have maximal freedom relative to everyone else's. And this has to include not just liberal freedom and equality, or so-called negative liberty, but also a commitment to substantive social and spiritual freedom as well. Secondly, I think that we need to recognize that one area where reactionaries and conservatives have always had an edge on liberals and progressives is the kind of ideologies they put forward often pivot around a source of transcendent meaning for people. This can come in the form of God, the eternal tradition, the nation, Western civilization, commitment to a strongman, you name it, right? Constant critical theorists have deconstructed this tendency to invest a transcendent source of meaning with all kinds of ideological connotations. Oftentimes it's critiqued as a form of sublimation. And I think that we should continue to do this, right? There's no problem with engaging in these kinds of critiques. But I think it's also obvious that just appealing to people's crude materialism and a desire for democratic participation isn't going to cut it, since people need a sense of the why rather than just the what and how of life. And here I think a progressive and liberal project that emphasizes the importance of democratic life in forming communities and equal and emancipated communities can provide an answer. Qua Hegel, we can start to postulate how a new demos will provide a sense of recognition to everyone as equals, which in turn can provide a rejuvenated sense of meaning that we construct together. And I think this would be a big improvement on the kind of hyper-real, manically competitive, individualistic neoliberal society that we see right now, where social freedom and the construction of communities isn't necessarily prohibited, but it's certainly not incentivized by global economic and political structures.
Thank you very much, Matt. Since Mojca already provided a part of her answer before, I'm going to leave her up for last to have a few concluding words, and I'm going to give the word to Ksenija now.
What Matt just said, I would transcribe that everything into the school curricula for the next generation. My main concern is that we are stuck here with a highly polarized society charged with emotions, as Mojca said. I've been reading in the past few months several studies in social psychology which look into how to really reduce this tension to serve in democratic processes. And what this scholarship suggests is that because it's about emotions, also cognitive identity struggle, but mainly because it's emotions, we need to work with emotions, and we need to embrace compassion, which of course probably works within a small community and family environment. For instance, when you discover that you have a far-right person in your neighborhood or within your family, conspiracy theory subscriber, then perhaps compassion is really the right response. And apparently it has worked with Ku Klux Klan members who asked for help, wanted to go on rehabilitation. Compassion was the first step toward regaining a sense of dignity and humanity. At a large scale, I doubt that this would work. Plus, we don't have time to really convert people from their hatred and furious, violent acts. So basically, it seems to me that we have a much harder work, really, one which entails asking ourselves, can we go back a little bit to just find the smallest common ground where we debate common good? Is common goods a value at all, still a value, or we really don't want to talk about that anymore? So that's first, whether we have an agreement, a minimal agreement of whether we want to think about what's public good, what's common good. And of course, we will instantly disagree. So basically, another approach, which has also been propagated by some anthropologists and sociologists, is that we really somehow introduce transgenerational thinking, in the sense of transgenerational solidarity, in the sense that we ask ourselves, is this really the world that we want our children, our loved ones from the next generation to live in? So basically that we project our social contract into the future. And this perhaps may relieve some of the tension that is going on around among us. But basically, I think it seems to me that the main work will have to be done within schools, basically, to regain the sense of democratic deliberation, the democratic institutions, progress, humanity, dignity, basically all core Enlightenment values, which we need to restore for the 21st century.
Thank you, Ksenija. I've seen you've already admitted to being guilty of cultural Marxism by wanting to manipulate the minds of the youth. I'm sure we'll be charged of similar accusations in the coming years. Mojca, I will leave to you the final words of this round of questions, and then we open up the discussion.
An attempt to address the big Leninist, all-encompassing question. No, I just want to draw from where Ksenija mentioned, yes, compassion. I immediately thought of feminist literature, dialogue with the concepts of ethics of care, the politics of listening, whether we could engage more into that direction. And I agree with you, the notion of the common good, the notion of the public, the value of use of reason or use of debate in the public sphere. So the concepts, the old concepts from the Frankfurt School onwards. Maybe if I just briefly touch this issue in the context of the media development, I think that the future should actually tackle some of the media policy failures, such as concentrated ownership we've been viewing in the last 50 years, or the big question or the failure to regulate tech companies. So this, I think, are the debates ahead of us. The failure also to nurture independent public media. So I think there is a lot of work that still needs to be done in kind of restoring the relevance of the public media. So of course, the hyper reality, the digital culture has changed. Traditional journalism is not anymore the sole, agenda setter. So the communication is multi-way, is networked. And to maybe also address on the more optimist side, the hyper reality of this hybrid contemporary media also enabled progressive mobilization of bottom-up movements. For example, the Black Lives Matter in the recent, since we're addressing the US context. So, and I think that this context of hybrid media system provide yet unseen opportunities for the future to facilitate productive conversation across social, cultural divides, not to retreat to ideological bubbles. So So I guess the future would need to address the digital culture, how it is designed, how it is governed, and how it is also appropriated in everyday life, possibly finding spaces to resist authoritarianism and promote responsible and truthful communication.
Thank you, Mojca. Wise words. Thanks to all of the participants. And now we open up the floor for questions. Please raise your hands if you want to pose a question. Okay, I see Andrei already has something to ask. So I think it's best if we do one by one. One person, one question at a time, and then we go forward. Okay, Andrei, please. Andrei, something is seriously wrong with your sound. I think you should maybe log off and log on for a second. Okay. Want to raise their hands in the meantime? You can do that both on the participants list by just, clicking raise hand, or doing that visually. I don't know. Okay. No questions so far. So I guess until Andrei comes back to us and join. Someone is writing something to me about technical stuff. Well, let's. Andrei's back.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you perfectly.
I do not have a question, I have a comment. I think that Trump is gone now, and I think that he was an aberration. And he was, because Washington Post had yesterday counted more than 30,000 lies and misleading statements that he made, which is something which is a breakdown of public communication. And I think that now that he stepped down, that there is another president, that this is finished. And because of great influence of American political life over the globe, I hope that the whole political climate will change with another president. It doesn't matter that it's Joe Biden. It's important that it's not Trump, who was a serial cheat, a liar and cheat. Yes, so I think that this is finished now. And the important thing is to insist on truth. We have to make a difference between facts and value. Trump was lying about facts. It's not possible to have opinion about facts because, for example, Ted Cruz said, okay, my opinion is that Trump won, not Biden won. That's not possible to have opinion. This is the question of facts, it's the question of evidence, and evidence was definitely on Biden's side, so there is no question about that. You can have different opinions, but these are different value judgments, different ideologies that we can discuss. But if we are lying, if there are lies, if there are untruths, and that was Trump, public communication is impossible, democracy is impossible, and there is direct way to fascism, which Trump tried to do and fortunately didn't succeed in that. So this is one thing. The other thing is social media. social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc., they are like telephone network. This is user-generated content. Everybody can say everything or write everything. There are no gatekeepers, no control. But I hope, that's my hope for the future, that with the end of Trump era, this will change as well, because there has to be some kind of public or political culture of communication, that people are not insulting each other, that they are not engaged in hate speech, that even if you do not agree with someone politically, that you have to have at least minimal respect to other people, that to respect their dignity as persons, because that's the only way that we can communicate publicly. As Ksenija said, we have to try to move to another level of public debate about common good. What is common good? What are the best solutions in political sense for different decision making? So I hope to finish here. I hope that with the end of Trump era, things will turn for the better. Even the insults and hate speech on social media, especially on Twitter, I hope that they will slowly peter out, that they will slowly, that people will be smart enough not to fall for such stupid things. Of course, all these conspiracy theories and lies, they will continue, but I hope that there is a kind of turn for the better. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Andrei, for your comment. I guess, Matt, do you want to start by commenting upon the comment?
Sure. Well, I would say nothing would make me happier than thinking that with Trump losing the presidency, the Trump era, if you want to call it that, is gone over, right? It would make up for, all the kind of bad things that happened over Christmas, all the things that happened over 2020 and so on. I don't think that that's necessarily the case, though. And the reason is that I don't think that Trump is actually independently all that effective a politician. We saw that from the very beginning, that he struggled to push forward any kind of firm legislative agenda, even when he had all the different houses under the control of the GOP, and he's remained consistently pretty unpopular. But saying that, the kind of forces which allowed Trumpism to emerge and seize the presidency, despite a lack of popular support, are still in place. And what does this mean that we're going to see a kind of resurgence of Trumpism in 4 years? I think it's possible, especially if there's another charismatic leader who's able to come in and assume the role that Trump has played, particularly if it's a charismatic leader who also happens to be a lot more effective. But of course, I don't have a magic ball, so I can't say whether that's going to happen. But I certainly don't want to rule out the possibility.
Thank you, Matt. Mojca or Ksenija, does any of you want to reply? Ksenija, would you like to go first?
I just envy Andrei's optimism, always optimistic. I am more concerned, but I just wanted to report that Joe Biden has been successfully inaugurated, and so far no incidents. So yes, definitely we hope that some fuel will be removed from this passionate engine that was throwing through the public sphere in the past 4 or 5 years, but conditions for the new Trump are still there, I fear, and we need to really be on the watch all the time, because not just social media, also I've been following the mainstream media, CNN and MSNBC, for the past 2 weeks, and I am concerned that they are actually trying to blame the whole situation on Trump and on the MAGA movement and the mob that actually attacked the Capitol. But they are really not eager to address larger questions, which I think we do need. So what is the future of democracy? And of course, what are also the struggles that are ahead of us in terms of economic inequality, discrimination, race, of course, racism for the US, but also across the globe. And so I think there are a lot of unanswered questions, and we do hope that the democratic leadership, the new democratic leadership will address some of those. Just today, I read a very hopeful, actually, a scenario proposed by Bernie Sanders in The Guardian with priorities that he's going to push forward. One of them, public education for all with no tuition fees. I think that's a very good start. So empower to get a new sense of what really means to be empowered. Not through emotion, not through illusion, not through fantasy, not through leader, but through really cognition and dignified education, dignifying yourself through education.
Thank you, Ksenija. Do you have anything to add, Mojca?
Well, just briefly that, yes, I mean, during this debate, we've actually tried to touch these larger structural changes that have been happening during the 5 decades, and I think all the discussion has actually argued that Trump is a symptom of these developments. So it's yeah, I also, I mean, you know, would want to share this optimism, but as I think we've tried to show, the structural settings are there already. So what I would expect with Biden's communication is perhaps less, you know, less hostile communication, less hostile, and as you said, this lying, spreading lies kind of communication might have a more positive effect on the society, on the voters. So in terms of a bit of softening of this antagonistic communication, I think we can expect this. But as Ksenija and Matthew said, I mean, this is yeah, it's probably a new type of political communication, but the issues, the problems, the class struggle, rising authoritarianism, social deprivation, democracy decline are still there. So, and I'm not sure in this sense that Biden is actually the answer to these bigger structural issues.
Thank you, Mojca. Yeah, Matthew. Yes.
Sorry, yeah, no, what I always like to say is, imagine if Viktor Orban was in charge of the United States instead, right? We'd be looking at a very different scenario, since Orban, unlike Trump, is actually a very skillful politician while being in a liberal authoritarian, right? And what I really worry about, as everyone here has pointed out, is what happens if somebody like Orban is eventually able to seize control of the Republican Party and then the White House. I think we'll be in for a much longer ride in that circumstance.
If I understand correctly, there already are potential candidates to fulfill this role. So people such as Senator Josh Hawley, so younger Republican candidates who seem to be, yeah, more effective, more skillful, can present themselves in a way which is different from Trump, which is perhaps more appealing to centrist voters in the future, but would definitely represent a strong rightward shift in American politics. If you think that's a fair assessment. So, okay. Anyone else? Does anyone else have any question or comments? No. Let's keep on focusing on each other then. Is there something any of you would like to add? Something that hasn't been said so far, something that you think we should have emphasized a bit more and is important to the current discussion?
I'll say something and then I do have to go for my department meeting. One of the things that I really am hoping, and I'm actually optimistic we'll be seeing over the next couple of years, is a reevaluation by liberals and of progressives of the association between Trump and the broader conservative and reactionary tradition, right? There's a lot of good books that have been produced recently by academics on the history of conservative thought and conservative movements. Corey Robbins' The Reactionary Mind is probably the most famous one, but Edmund Fawcett just released Conservatism, A Fight for Tradition recently. And I think that these kind of efforts are really important because when you look at a lot of what you see with Trumpism, you see that while it is certainly very novel, it's borrowing a lot from the playbook that conservatives have been using for a long time. I mean, you can go back to Edmund Burke and see him ranting about the philosophes and how it is that they have these weird abstract plans and they're elites and they're out of touch, as opposed to, you know, the good, hardworking, middle-class Englander who has a better understanding of how the world works than they ever could. And therefore, we should vest him with the opportunity to express his political opinions rather than the kind of hoity-toity Parisians, right? And you can see trends like this throughout the history of conservative thought, and being more attentive to those, I think, can give us some insight into what the next Trump or Trump-type figure will look like.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, are you leaving us already?
I do have to go to make this meeting, but it was a real pleasure to meet you, and thank you very much. I hope one day that we'll be able to meet in person, hopefully under way better circumstances than right now.
Okay, it was a pleasure to have you too. So have a nice day and have a nice inauguration day in the US. Hopefully there won't be any real shit going down
Yeah,
today.
I boarded up my windows. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, glede na to, da vidim, da so vsi prisotni tukaj samo še govorci slovenskega jezika, bi seveda zdaj pozval, če ima kdo še kakšno posebno vprašanje za zastaviti oziroma kakšen komentar, ki bi ga rad izpostavil. Drugače pa lahko z nocojšnjo debato tudi počasi zaključimo.
Če lahko jaz dva stavka še rečem, ker jaz sem prej govoril samo o komunikacijski situaciji, tu sem optimističen v smislu, da bo vendarle z koncem Trumpove ere situacija nekoliko boljša, da bo manj tega sovražnega govora, da bo manj slabega vpliva, pač ker Amerika ima ta ogromen vpliv na svet. Ampak druga stvar je, kar se tiče socialne, politične, ekonomske situacije, je pa problem v 3 stavkih: neoliberalna globalizacija, davčne oaze, slamnata podjetja, nenadzor nad gibanjem kapitala globalno in pa predvsem velika stopnja neenakosti, ki posebej v razvitem svetu je to deindustrializacija razvitega sveta, outsourcing delovno intenzivnih industrij v tretji svet, posledica je pa obubožanje srednjega in delavskega razreda in to je razlog, da se je Trump pojavil in to je res, da pač tudi te mainstream mediji v Ameriki tega niso priznali. Da pravzaprav Trump je posledica, ne vzrok, da je prišel. Ampak to je pa težji problem, kako bomo ta redistribucija. Jaz mislim, da problem je velik kriza levice. Levica je povsem, ne govorim o Sloveniji, govorim o svetovni levici. Svetovna levica je popolnoma brez vsake vizije. V bistvu desnica pristaja na obstoječe, hoče iztisniti iz tega čim več. Levica pa obstaja pri levičarski kritiki poblagovljenja itd. Pravzaprav nima alternative. Levica nima vizije, to je ključen problem in tudi ga ne bomo rešili zdaj, žal. Ampak ok, toliko.
Ok, bi rad kdo še kaj dodal tako od gostov kot od publike? Ne? Ok, vidim, da smo vsi že utrujeni od vseh teh zoomov, ki jih trpimo na dnevni ravni. Tako da bi se vsem današnjim poslušalcem zahvalil v imenu katedre za to je Peter Levstek, to je aplavz ali dvignjena roka, težko rečem. Recimo, da aplavz. V imenu katedre za medijske in komunikacijske študije. Zahvalil bi se našima gostjama, tretjega gosta žal več ni, za prisotnost na tej debati. Želim vam lep preostanek večera in le odprite televizijo, da si ogledate najnovejše novice o inauguraciji, kar bomo najverjetneje storili tudi mi. Lep večer želim vsem skupaj.
Hvala, pozdravljeni, živijo.
Hvala, Dio.
Dio.
Hvala vsem.